Welcome back to Midnight at WolfCloud Station. I'm your host, Sierra Sterling. Somewhere beyond mile marker 47, where the asphalt fractures and the tree line swallows the horizon, there are places on the map that simply do not want us there. Places that tolerate our presence for a brief, fleeting moment before deciding to take something back. Tonight, we are traveling to the deep, freezing wilderness of the American Northeast. A region of towering pines, jagged metamorphic bedrock, and silent, sweeping valleys that hold onto their secrets with a lethal, suffocating grip. The locals know it as the Green Mountain National Forest, but for those who study the strange, the unexplained, and the deeply terrifying, it is known by another name, the Bennington Triangle. To understand the profound darkness that fell over southwestern Vermont between 1945 and 1950, you first have to understand the land itself. Glastenbury Mountain rises over 3,700 feet into the cold New England sky. The bedrock here is incredibly ancient. It was forged over 400 million years ago when the continent was just taking shape, pushed upward by violent tectonic collisions. It is a rugged, unforgiving terrain cut through by the Appalachian Trail and the Long Trail. The woods are aggressively dense, choked with white birch, red spruce, and mountain ash. Beneath the heavy canopy, shadows pool in the ravines even at high noon. It is undeniably beautiful, and it is entirely desolate. Long before the first European settlers tried to tame this land with axes and industry, the indigenous Abenaki people steered clear of Glastenbury Mountain. They believed the peak was profoundly cursed. Their oral histories and legends spoke of a dark, brooding presence, of malevolent spirits that lingered in the high timber, and of a mythical man-eating stone that would consume anyone foolish enough to step upon it. They utilized the surrounding, lower valleys for burying their dead, respecting the boundary of the foothills. But the mountain itself, that was forbidden territory, a place where the rules of reality seemed to bend, and where the land possessed a hunger of its own. But industrial progress does not listen to ancient warnings. In the mid-19th century, the great New England logging boom brought men with saws and a thirst for profit to the slopes of Glastenbury. Two primary settlements, South Glastenbury and Fayetteville, sprang up directly from the dirt. They were rough, violent, isolated logging camps that eventually grew into moderately thriving industrial towns. The air was constantly thick with the acrid smoke of charcoal kilns and the deafening, mechanical grinding of sawmills operated by the Eagle Square Company. For a brief, arrogant moment, humanity thought it had conquered the mountain. They even built a specialized railroad and an expensive resort casino in the summer of 1898, attempting to turn the rugged wilderness into a playground for the wealthy. But the mountain always wins. A massive, catastrophic flood washed out the train tracks along Bowles Brook that very same winter. The timber eventually dried up as the slopes were clear-cut. The mills shuttered their doors. The people packed up their lives and left. By 1937, the population of Glastenbury had dwindled to just 7 isolated residents. It was so completely desolate that the state of Vermont took the highly unusual step of officially unincorporating the town. Glastenbury and its neighboring settlement, Somerset, became true, legally recognized ghost towns. The forest aggressively reclaimed the stone foundations, the deep logging wells, and the dirt roads. The silence returned, heavier than before. And then, the mountains started taking people. The first to vanish was a man who knew the woods better than anyone alive. His name was Mitty Rivers. He was 74 years old, a seasoned outdoorsman, and a highly respected hunting guide. Rivers had spent his entire life navigating the treacherous hollows and freezing brooks of the Bennington area. He knew the land like the back of his hand. He understood the weather patterns, the behavior of the wildlife, and the hidden dangers of the steep terrain. It was November 12th, 1945. The air was biting, carrying the sharp, metallic promise of a harsh winter. Rivers was guiding a party of 4 hunters through the heavy timber near Bickford Hollow, just about 4 miles east of Bennington. The group had been out for hours, tracking game through the thick brush. The terrain was entirely familiar. Rivers had walked this specific trail countless times. He frequented a hunting camp nearby that belonged to his son-in-law. There was absolutely no reason for a man of his vast experience to lose his bearings. As the afternoon light began to fail, dipping behind the jagged ridgeline around 4 o'clock, Rivers made a simple, fatal decision. He told the hunters he was going to walk slightly ahead of them to scout the trail near Hell Hollow Brook. He stepped into the woods, his boots crunching on the dead leaves. The hunters followed a short distance behind, expecting to see his silhouette waiting for them at the next bend. They never saw him again. When Rivers failed to return to the camp that evening, a deep unease settled over the group. A man like Mitty Rivers doesn't just get lost. By nightfall, the unease had turned to outright panic. A massive search party was quickly organized. This wasn't a cursory look through the woods by a few concerned friends. The disappearance of a local legend mobilized the entire community. Firemen, local volunteers, and soldiers deployed from Fort Devens and the Vermont State Guard marched into the wilderness. They combed every inch of Bickford Hollow. They searched the dark ravines, the caves, the abandoned logging roads, and the freezing streams. The searchers were confident they would find him. Even if he had suffered a sudden medical emergency, like a massive heart attack or a stroke, his body would be there. People had gotten lost in these woods before, but they were always recovered. The search spanned over a month. They pushed through rain, sleet, and the rapidly dropping temperatures of late autumn. But the forest offered almost nothing. The only trace of Mitty Rivers found during that exhaustive initial search was a single, unfired brass rifle cartridge lying in a stream bed. The following spring, after the snows had melted, a hiker stumbled upon Rivers' folded handkerchief on a trail south of his last known location. And that was it. A man with decades of wilderness survival experience had seemingly evaporated into the freezing air. No blood, no signs of an animal attack, no body. The community was deeply unsettled, but they rationalized it. They told themselves that accidents happen, that an old man might have simply pushed himself too far, fallen into a hidden crevasse left over from the logging days, and succumbed to the elements before anyone could reach him. They tried to move on. They tried to convince themselves that the woods were safe. But exactly 1 year later, the Bennington Triangle would prove them wrong. And the next victim would not be an old man at the end of his life. It would be a young woman at the very beginning of hers. December 1st, 1946. The sprawling, secluded campus of Bennington College was quiet. The post-war era had brought a sense of cautious optimism to the country, but up here in the mountains, the geographical isolation was profound. Paula Jean Weldon was 18 years old. She was a sophomore, a talented art major with bright blue eyes, wavy blonde hair, and a fiercely independent streak. She was the eldest daughter of William Weldon, a prominent industrial engineer from Connecticut. She lived in Dewey House, one of the older, stately dormitories on the college grounds. It was a Sunday. Paula worked the afternoon lunch shift at the college dining hall. When her shift ended, she returned to her room, changed out of her work clothes, and casually mentioned to her roommate that she was going for a walk to clear her head. She wasn't wearing heavy hiking gear. She was dressed for a mild afternoon stroll, a bright red parka with a fur-trimmed hood, blue jeans, and lightweight canvas sneakers. She carried no backpack. She had no extra money, no flashlight, and no heavy winter clothing. From all appearances, she clearly expected to be gone for only a few hours. She walked to the campus entrance and stuck out her thumb. Hitchhiking was common and considered relatively safe in rural Vermont at the time. A passing motorist named Louis Knapp, a local contractor, picked her up. Paula told him she wanted to hike a section of the long trail. Knapp drove her a few miles and dropped her off on Route 9, near the Furnace Bridge, just a short distance from the trailhead in Woodford Hollow. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon. The temperature was already beginning to drop. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, heavy with the threat of snow. Paula walked the rest of the way to the trail. Along the dirt stretch known as Harbor Road, she crossed paths with a group of hikers coming down from the mountain. Among them was a man who worked for the local newspaper, the Bennington Banner. Paula stopped and asked them a few questions about the trail, specifically asking how far it went. They warned her that the trail stretched all the way to Canada and that the weather was rapidly turning hostile. She thanked them and kept walking north. into the darkening woods, into the deep, freezing shadows of Glastenbury Mountain. She was last seen around 4 in the afternoon. Shortly after that, the snow began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets. When Paula failed to return to Dewey House that night, her roommate assumed she had simply gone to the library to study late for exams. But when morning came and her bed was still empty, cold panic set in. The college administrators were notified. The Bennington County State's attorney was alerted. The county sheriff was called in to coordinate a search. What followed was one of the most massive, desperate, and ultimately frustrating search efforts in the history of New England. Paula's father, William Weldon, rushed to Vermont from Connecticut. He was utterly appalled by what he found. Law enforcement in Vermont at the time was entirely county-based. There was no state police force. The local sheriffs were ill-equipped, severely underfunded, and completely overwhelmed by the logistics of coordinating a massive, multi-agency wilderness search. They had no central command structure, no standardized radio communication, and no experience in managing the hundreds of civilian volunteers, National Guard troops, and firefighters who flooded into the freezing woods to find the girl in the red coat. They scoured the Bowles Brook Valley. They hiked up toward the Fay Fuller camp. They combed 10 miles of the long trail up to the freezing, windswept summit of Glastenbury Mountain. Aircraft flew low over the canopy, looking for any flash of bright red against the stark white snow. New York and Connecticut State Police were called in to cross state lines and assist. Even the FBI eventually got involved in the investigation. A $5,000 reward was posted by the family, an absolute fortune at the time. But there was nothing, not a single footprint, not a scrap of red fabric snagged on a branch, not a single verifiable clue. The rumors started almost immediately, filling the vacuum left by the lack of evidence. Some said she was depressed and had walked into the woods with no intention of ever coming out. Others whispered that she had succumbed to the freezing temperatures, falling into an abandoned logging well where the heavy snow quickly buried her body. But the darkest theories pointed to something far more sinister. They pointed to the transient people living on the extreme edges of society. Years later, author Michael C. Dooling would propose that a highly organized serial killer was using the long trail as a hunting ground. Suspicion fell heavily on a local lumberjack named Fred Gadet, who lived near the trail. He had a reputation for violence. He had been arguing with his girlfriend the day Paula vanished, and he reportedly gave highly conflicting statements to the police during interrogations. Decades later, he would drunkenly boast to bar patrons that he knew exactly where Paula Weldon was buried. But without a body and without a crime scene, the police could do absolutely nothing. The case went ice cold. The tragic legacy of Paula Weldon did force one monumental change. Her father's blistering, highly public criticism of the botched local investigation reached the highest levels of state government. In 1947, Governor Ernest W. Gibson and the Vermont legislature officially passed Act 163. This legislation created the Department of Public Safety and the modern Vermont State Police. A centralized, highly trained agency born directly from the ashes of a father's immense grief, and a mystery that completely refused to be solved. The psychological toll on the local community was devastating. The woods were no longer just a place of natural, environmental danger. They were a place of profound, existential dread. Shirley Jackson, the legendary author who would later write The Haunting of Hill House, lived in North Bennington at the time. Her husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, taught literature at Bennington College. The disappearance of Paula Weldon deeply unnerved Jackson. It seeped into her highly anxious mind and poisoned her view of the idyllic rural landscape. She obsessively clipped newspaper articles about the search, keeping them in a dedicated file. The vanishing of the young co-ed directly inspired Jackson's brilliant psychological novel, Hang Salmon, and her chilling short story, The Missing Girl. Jackson understood what the locals were beginning to realize. The mountain wasn't just dangerous, it was hungry. Exactly 3 years later, to the very day, December 1st, 1949. The people of Bennington had spent 36 months constantly looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows in the tree line. The trauma of Paula Weldon's unsolved disappearance still hung heavy in the freezing mountain air. The town had changed. Children weren't allowed to play near the woods. Hunters kept their rifles loaded at all times. And then the impossible happened again. But this time, it didn't happen in the deep, isolated woods. It happened in plain sight, surrounded by witnesses. James Tedford was 68 years old. He was a combat veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen the absolute horrors of trench warfare and survived, only to end up living quietly at the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington. He was described by some as severely despondent, carrying the heavy, invisible psychological burdens that so many veterans bore in complete silence. He was a man who felt he had very little left to lose. In late November, Tedford had traveled north to St. Albans to visit relatives. On the 1st of December, his family drove him to the local bus station. They watched him purchase a ticket. They watched him physically board a southbound bus. There was no ambiguity about his movements. The journey south was long and tedious. The bus stopped at a depot in Burlington, where Tedford was clearly seen disembarking, having a brief, casual conversation with an acquaintance on the platform, and then reboarding a connecting bus bound directly for Bennington. It was around 6:15 in the evening. The winter sun had completely set, plunging the rural Vermont highways into absolute, pitch-black darkness. There were 14 other passengers on that bus. There was an experienced driver. Multiple people confirmed seeing James Tedford sitting quietly in his seat, his head resting against the cold glass, sleeping peacefully as the heavy vehicle rumbled through the frigid night. He was seen clearly at the last scheduled stop before Bennington. But when the air brakes hissed and the bus finally pulled into the station in Bennington, James Tedford was gone. His luggage was still sitting in the overhead rack. An open bus timetable was resting neatly on his empty seat. No one had seen him stand up. No one had heard the heavy, pneumatic doors open while the bus was in motion. The driver was completely baffled. A man cannot simply dematerialize from a moving metal box traveling down a dark, isolated highway. It defied all known logic. For an entire week, his disappearance went unreported. The superintendent of the soldiers' home finally notified the police on December 8th, assuming Tedford had just extended his family visit. In the days that followed, highly conflicting reports trickled in. A bus driver thought a man resembling Tedford might have gotten off in the village of Brandon, 70 miles north of Bennington. The Brandon police investigated a report of a man acting strangely in the downtown area that same night, but nothing could be confirmed. The 14 witnesses on the bus swore he was there until the very end. The authorities were completely paralyzed. How do you investigate a locked room mystery on a moving highway? Did James Tedford wake up in a moment of sheer panic, force the emergency exit, and step out into the freezing wilderness to end his own life? Did he slip out the door at a stop sign when the driver wasn't looking? Or did the strange, localized gravity of the Bennington Triangle reach out and pull him into the ether? 75 years later, not a single trace of the veteran has ever been found. Less than a year later, the Triangle would strike again. And this time, it would take the most vulnerable target of all. It was October 12th, 1950, a crisp, beautiful autumn day in New England. 8-year-old Paul Jepson was riding in the passenger seat of his mother's pickup truck. They were driving out to a rural farm located near the Bennington town dump. His mother worked at the farm, tending to the animals. Paul was an energetic, happy child. That afternoon, the autumn chill had set in, and his mother had dressed him warmly. She zipped him into a bright red jacket, the exact same color worn by Paula Weldon 4 years prior. His mother parked the truck near the pig pens. She told Paul to stay in the vehicle, to play quietly while she went to feed the animals. She was gone for perhaps an hour, a single hour. When she returned, she found the truck door swinging gently open in the breeze. The cab was empty. Paul was nowhere to be seen. She called out his name, her voice echoing off the tree line. Silence. Panic is a cold, sudden thing. She immediately ran for help, and within hours, the local police, volunteers, and the newly formed Vermont State Police were swarming the farm. They brought in highly trained tracking bloodhounds, hoping the boy had simply wandered off into the brush chasing a stray dog or a shiny object. The dogs picked up his scent immediately. They put their noses to the dirt and began pulling hard against their leashes. The track led directly away from the farm, cutting through a patch of woods, moving steadily toward the local highway. But when the dogs reached the paved edge of Route 9, they stopped. They circled frantically. They whined, confused. The scent didn't fade away gradually. It ended in a sheer, abrupt wall, right at the asphalt. Investigators theorized that the boy must have been picked up by a passing motorist, but a massive canvass of the area yielded absolutely no witnesses. No one had seen a car stopped on that stretch of road. No one had seen a little boy in a bright red jacket walking along the shoulder. He had simply vanished at the crossroads. 2 horrific disappearances in less than a year. A veteran swallowed by a moving bus, and a little boy erased at the edge of the highway. The town of Bennington was on the verge of total, uncontrollable hysteria. The woods were no longer safe. The roads were no longer safe. The very air felt poisonous. But the nightmare of 1950 was far from over. 16 days. That is how long the town of Bennington had to process the horrifying disappearance of 8-year-old Paul Jepson before the forest took its final victim. October 28, 1950. Frietta Langer was 53 years old. She was not a fragile, unprepared, or inexperienced person. She was a hardened, highly active outdoorswoman who knew the Glastenbury wilderness intimately. She had spent years hiking the trails, hunting, and navigating the extremely rugged topography near the Somerset Reservoir, an area that sat adjacent to the old, unincorporated ghost towns. Frietta and her cousin left their family campsite that afternoon for a routine hike. The air was brisk, the leaves turning brilliant, dyeing shades of rust and gold. About a half-mile into the trek, Frietta slipped while crossing a small, shallow stream. She plunged into the freezing water, soaking her clothes. Shivering in the sharp autumn wind, Frietta told her cousin to wait there. She was going to run back to the campsite, change into dry clothes, and immediately return. It was broad daylight. The camp was just a short, straight walk away. She turned around and jogged back down the familiar trail. Her cousin waited and waited. As the minutes stretched into an hour, unease crept in. Finally, the cousin walked back to the camp to check on her, but Frietta hadn't arrived. She never made it back to the tent. In the span of a half-mile walk, in broad daylight, a seasoned hiker simply vanished off the face of the earth. Because this was the 5th disappearance in 5 years, the response from the state was instantaneous and overwhelming. The authorities weren't going to let this happen again. They mounted the largest, most comprehensive search in the history of Vermont. Helicopters chopped through the sky, scanning the canopy. Hundreds of volunteers, local police, and the military scoured the area. They formed massive human chains, walking shoulder to shoulder through the dense brush, ensuring that not a single square foot of the Somerset area went unexamined. They searched the woods, the deep ravines, the shores of the reservoir, and the stream where she had fallen. Nothing. The operation was eventually called off as winter slammed into the Green Mountains, burying the landscape in deep snow. The community braced itself for another permanently unsolved mystery. But 7 months later, in May of 1951, the pattern broke. A group of hikers walking through an open clearing near the Somerset Reservoir stumbled upon a horrifying sight. It was a human body, severely decomposed after months exposed to the brutal Vermont winter and local wildlife. Dental records confirmed it was Frietta Langer. She was the only victim of the Bennington Triangle ever to be found. But the discovery raised infinitely more questions than it answered. The clearing where her body lay had been exhaustively searched by hundreds of men the previous autumn. It was not a hidden crevasse. It was not a deep cave. It was an open area that searchers had walked directly over multiple times. It was physically impossible for them to have missed her. This suggested a terrifying reality. Frietta Langer's body had not been there during the initial search. It had been moved to that clearing at a later date. The medical examiner took the remains, hoping to finally uncover a cause of death that could explain the madness of the last 5 years. Was she stabbed, shot, strangled? But due to the extreme state of decomposition, the coroner could determine absolutely nothing. No cause of death, no signs of trauma that could be definitively proven. Just a body returned by the woods, carrying its secrets into the grave. With the recovery of Frietta Langer, the disappearances abruptly stopped. But the legend was just beginning to take root. Decades later, the author and folklorist Joseph A. Citro began digging through the archives. He noticed the undeniable cluster of vanishings centered around Glastenbury Mountain. He saw the bizarre, uncanny similarities. The time of day, the dropping temperatures, the colors of the clothing, the proximity to the long trail. He coined the phrase, the Bennington Triangle, forever branding the region in the annals of American true crime and paranormal lore. The theories have raged for decades. Author Michael C. Dooling meticulously researched the cases and proposed a grounded, deeply terrifying explanation. A serial killer was using the long trail as a hunting ground. He pointed to the transient lumberjacks, the isolated locals with histories of severe violence, and the fact that a killer could easily use the unforgiving terrain to dispose of victims. The fact that Frietta Langer's body was seemingly dumped in a previously searched clearing strongly points to human intervention. But others looked to the ancient Abenaki warnings. They looked to the ghost towns of Fayville and Glastenbury, erased from the map by a government that realized the land could not be tamed. They point to the bizarre physics of James Tedford vanishing from a moving bus, or the sudden end of a bloodhound's track at the edge of the asphalt. They argue that something fundamental is broken in the geography of Glastenbury Mountain. A tear in the fabric, a blind spot in reality. Whatever the truth is, the Green Mountains refuse to confess. The long trail is still hiked by thousands of people every year. Most of them emerge from the tree line tired, but safe. But as the sun dips below the jagged ridges and the temperature plummets, and the shadows stretch long and dark across the path, the history of the Bennington Triangle whispers through the pines, a reminder that in the deep woods, you are never truly at the top of the food chain. Keep the doors locked, keep the volume low, the frequency is open. Midnight at WolfCloud Station is signing off.